Good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars, and if you're joining us for the first time this week, welcome to you. We especially want to welcome those joining us from Caulfield Shul. I want to thank Robert Wheel for facilitating tonight's guest, and also apologies again to Rabbi Krasnjansky and his group because he's taking a little break this week so that his shiur group can join us tonight. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. And joining me this evening is Michael Bird, who most people will know from our Nothing Left days on J-Air Jewish Community Radio. Good evening to you, Michael.
Good morning, or good evening, Alan, David, and Rabbi.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar with what we do, the AJA is a grassroots communal organisation based on Torah values and with a centre-right political perspective. We hold these weekly Zoom sessions on most Wednesday nights, and our guests include politicians, commentators and experts on Israel and the Jewish world from everywhere around the globe. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, the president of the AJA, as well as our special guest for tonight, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who we will introduce formally in a moment. Tonight's topic is one that I'm sure is bothering us all, and that is the subject of diaspora Jews abandoning both their Jewish identity and their support for Israel. The format will be as follows. Michael and I will chat with Rabbi Shmuley for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. Now, the way to ask a question, and we ask for just single questions, what you need to do is raise your hand electronically. And the way to do that is click on the participants or the reaction icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little hand image, and if you click on that, we get a signal that you want to ask a question, and then we put you in the line to ask the question. The chat function is available as usual, and as usual, we just ask people to stick to tonight's topic. Described by both Newsweek and the Washington Post as the most famous rabbi in America, Shmuley Boteach is well known to this audience as an American author of 33 books, a public speaker and a TV host. As a young man, Rabbi Boteach was chosen to be one of 10 Chabad students sent to Sydney to study yeshiva. And whilst there, he met the parents of a young lady, Debbie, who he subsequently married in 1988. He then returned to New York, took smicha, and served as the rabbi to Oxford University students for 11 years. Rabbi Shmuley, thanks for joining us at what is quite early in the morning for you. We do appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's very hard to say no to the Australian Jewish community, one of the true loves of my life, and I miss you all so much. I usually come to Australia once or twice a year, and that's been for more than 3 decades, thank God. And the coronavirus has made that challenging, if not impossible. So through the miracles of modern technology, I get to speak to all of you, albeit at an ungodly hour my time.
Michael.
Thanks, Alan. Rabbi, you probably don't remember, you attend so many functions and dinners, but we had lunch together last time you were here. I was honoured to be invited to our mutual friend Robert's Shabbat lunch. You were there with your lovely wife, and I think Rabbi Ganendi and his wife. So that was, I think, last year or the year before, I can't remember. Anyway,
well, let me just comment on that. I want to say a special hello to Robert Wheel, my dear friend. His son Daniel is in New York. Robert is a very close friend, and he's brought me to Australia to speak several times. Once for the giant Yom Ha'atzmaut luncheon, which was a great honor for me. I know that very prestigious people are invited to give that speech, but Robert was instrumental in making this happen. So, Robert, I can't see you as one of the participants. If you got me up at 6 a.m. and you're not on, you're in big trouble, okay?
Okay. Now, Rabbi, let me add to Alan's remarks that of particular interest to us is that you sponsor pro-Zionist newspaper ads in America. And sadly, you're one of only a few high-profile Jews in the United States with what we consider moral clarity, encouraged to speak out on Israel and the Jewish world, which appears to be desperately lacking amongst the majority of American liberal progressive Jews. Now, I want to follow this theme for my first question. Rabbi, when pro-Israel advocate Brigitte Gabriel, a Lebanese Christian, came to Australia a few years ago and spoke to students at Australia's largest Jewish day school, she told me later that she was shocked at some of the questions which portrayed Israel in a very bad light that were asked by the young Jewish students. Sadly, Australia is following in the footsteps of America, where our Jewish youth are being indoctrinated with progressive left ideology, part of which is not sympathetic to Israel. Now, considering the majority of our mainstream Jewish communal organizations are headed, in my view, by many woke progressive leftist types, how concerned are you for the next generation of diaspora Jews?
Well, firstly, I think that we have to stop expressing so much shock every time we hear young people, young men and women around the world, college students, especially on campus, expressing anti-Israel views or views that are unsympathetic to Israel. The shock has to stop. In fact, I think while it is getting progressively worse, no pun intended, this has been a trend for a very long time. Look, campuses are places with very liberal ideologies. They don't only dislike Israel, they often dislike the United States. They often dislike the Western democracies. They are often promoting, as you said, leftist, sometimes even Marxist, sometimes even socialist or communist ideologies. And Israel as a Western democracy, we should be proud that Israel is a Western democracy. But Israel, of course, has become a target for special opprobrium. And that's where the shock ought to be. The shock ought to be that why is Israel now being singled out? Look, during the Vietnam War, the United States was a great enemy on campus. It was portrayed as worse than even the communist dictatorship of North Korea. And the United States did a terrible job in representing itself. So there's one of two ways that we can look at how young people around the world are turning against Israel. One is to express shock and dissatisfaction and say that it's all about anti-Semitism. The other is to kind of take a look in the mirror and say to ourselves that regardless of the ideological enemies that are turning this tide, which I'll get to in just a moment, that we are still responsible because we are the ones who are failing to communicate our message. You mentioned our full page ads in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post. Those ads are designed to make sure that Israel's message is always communicated. Because I can't just throw my hands up in the air and say that this is all terrible. Look, when I arrived at Oxford University as the Rebbe's emissary and then started the Oxford University L'Chaim Society, that was the late 1988. And it was just the beginning of the demonization of Israel on campus. I say the beginning because just that year, Yasser Arafat had finally, quote, recognized Israel under tremendous pressure from the United States and Secretary of State George Shultz, who I think died this year. He was a good man. And so they were now allowed to be invited. It was in vogue to invite them onto Western campuses. And I remember that, I'm trying to remember, Bassem Abu Sharif, was that his name? One of the leading aides to Arafat came to the Oxford Union, early 1989. I was one of the first people to witness the demonization of Israel on campus. I remember it in his speech. We all expected him to give a speech about peace and reconciliation. Instead, it was an incredible attack on Israel. And I remember the cheering, and I said, oh my God, this is going to become a trend. But what we did at Oxford at the time was bring 6 Israeli prime ministers to respond, let alone with countless other Israeli ministers. But we brought Netanyahu twice. We brought Sharon, we brought Perez, Rabin, I could go on. So I find it a bit disappointing that we are so shocked by what's happening with young people and on campus, instead of just accepting upon ourselves that the failure to communicate is our own. Now, I could easily stand here, or sit here, I should say, and I could say that SJP, Students of Justice in Palestine, at NYU, for example, here in New York University, there are only 60 students on campus, and yet they passed several BDS resolutions, anti-Israel resolutions, while there are 6,000 Jewish undergraduates at NYU. I mean, so 1% of the Jewish students were the pro-BDS students, and they passed all of these resolutions. I could easily say it's the SJP's fault. I could go through all the other, Israel Apartheid Week. I could go through all the things that happened on campus that demonize Israel. But that would be giving the blame to our opponents as opposed to looking at ourselves and saying, how did we ever allow this? So let me just say very briefly, so that I don't go on about this answer. The failure of Jewish public relations, is not something new. This is something very ancient. Going back 2,000 years, we Jews were accused of something incredibly heinous, that we killed God, that we actually killed the source of all light in the universe, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was murdered by the Jews, and we couldn't respond appropriately to it because we thought no one would believe it. How do you kill God? 1,000 years later, we were accused of drinking the blood of Christian children and putting it on our matzahs. And we said, no one's going to believe it. So again, we didn't respond appropriately. 300 years later, we were accused of poisoning all the wells of Europe and the bubonic plague, the Black Death. And we said, no one's going to believe it. We drink the same water. There aren't enough Jews to poison all the wells of Europe. No one's going to believe it. I could go on. Enter the modern state of Israel. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, and Israel's now being demonized as the most authoritarian government, almost a SS Nazi-like government, apartheid government. And we say, we don't have to respond to this because no one's going to believe it. What we've learned throughout Jewish history is that there is no lie that can be said about the Jewish people that isn't going to be believed. So believe that it's going to believe. Don't be shocked. Don't raise our eyebrows in frustration that young people are believing this. This has happened since the beginning of time. It's happening now, and it's time for us to respond.
Rabbi, the topic of the last couple of weeks, of course, has been the Ben and Jerry's ice cream story, where even the two original founders have said how they support Unilever's boycott of Judea and Samaria. Is this indicative of the thinking of the majority of American Jews? Because if so, that's a big problem.
No, I don't think so. I think Ben and Jerry, the two founders who are no longer involved with the company's owned by Unilever, are really out of step. I was actually very heartened to see what an incredible price Ben and Jerry's paid. Look, during the Gaza war, these Hollywood celebrities who demonize Israel, they've been going on a riff about Israel for years, and they paid no price. Dua Lipa, the Hadid sisters, Mark Ruffalo, let alone, the really horrible people like, what's his name from formerly of Pink Floyd? He's the worst. But
Roger Waters.
Yeah, Roger Waters. So what we did is we took out a full-page ad in the New York Times that directly called out the Hadid sisters and Dua Lipa. And Dua Lipa responded to her 66 million Instagram followers, and we got into a big public brawl with her. Now forever, it was just she just did a cover story, I think, for Vogue and or GQ. Sorry, one of the big magazines. And in the bio, there is now always this brawl that she was accused in a full-page ad in the New York Times of anti-Semitism by leading American Jewish activists, and that she had to respond, etc. Well, you know what? Ever since that, we have seen, thank God, almost no criticism of Israel from any of the Hollywood celebrities. In fact, Mark Ruffalo, who was second worst to Roger Waters over the past decade and actually accused Israel of genocide, if you remember, he apologized 2 days after our ad. He apologized in a tweet, and he said that his demonization of Israel and his false accusations, he admitted they were false, of Israel engaging in genocide, is leading to an outbreak of anti-Semitism. So that was just 6 weeks ago during the war. Now with Ben and Jerry's, thank God we didn't have to take out an ad in the New York Times or any of the leading publications, because the American Jewish community all together, and many of our allies who are not even part of the Jewish community, and I mean even those who transcend even the Christian evangelical community, are out, because we have great allies, of course, in the evangelical community, but so many people came out against Ben and Jerry's. So I don't think it is indicative at all. I think that Unilever has been put in a very tough situation because 23 odd states here in the U.S., almost half the states have anti-BDS laws, and that means that Unilever can be be divested from the state pension funds, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've seen is how effective we can be when we work in concert. So the Ben and Jerry's thing has actually been kind of heartening. I think that they so far are losing the PR battle with their decision to boycott Israel.
Do you think that they were caught a bit by surprise by the severity of the response about this whole thing?
Absolutely, because we Jews are so used to taking it on the chin. Of course they were caught by surprise. It was, I tell you, there's been a monumental change, I think, since the last war. 6 weeks ago. Before that, the war was in 2014. And again, Israel was severely demonized. And I remember at the time the UN was going to launch a Goldstone level inquiry. And again, we took out an ad. They found a Canadian jurist who was going to head that inquiry. And we did some research about him. We discovered that he was taking honorariums from Iran and from their president, one of the most anti-Semitic leaders, for Iran. That's quite a big thing to be anti-Semitic even by Iranian standards. Ahmadinejad. We discovered that a Canadian jurist was organizing conferences and getting money from Iran. We did a campaign about that. He resigned about 10 days afterward, and that inquiry never went forward. But at the time, you remember 2014, there wasn't this kind of response. This past war, we saw the world Jewish community show their outrage at how Israel was being demonized. By the way, it was particularly bad. The assaults on Israel were particularly bad. But we did kind of rise to the occasion, not fully, not completely, and not sufficiently, but certainly more than ever before. And I think that the outrage being expressed at Ben & Jerry's is a continuation of that.
Michael?
Rabbi, George Soros funds anti-Zionist Jewish progressive groups such as J Street and New Israel Fund, the latter in particular causing a lot of damage to Israel's credibility in Australia by bringing out people like Breaking the Silence and other anti-Zionist speakers, which only adds fuel to the fire, increasing anti-Semitism. In my view, Jews that criticize Israel, Jewish activists, are the worst ones that we come across. But how much damage are these groups doing to Israel's image, particularly in America, J Street?
Well, that's an interesting question, because recently a friend of mine was organizing an anti-Semitism rally, and they reached out to J Street in the hope of creating a big tent. And I said to them, with all due respect, I also want to see a big tent. Thank God Israel's a democracy, and it reflects a very wide panoply of views, and that's what should also be reflected in the world Jewish community on the political left and the political right. I said, but there are some red lines. I believe that J Street is an anti-Israel organization, masquerading as a pro-Israel organization. J Street regularly lobbies members of Congress against Israel, shocking as that sounds. And you are correct in saying that, unfortunately, again, this is not anything new. Unfortunately, Jewish self-criticism, and going well beyond that at times, Jewish anti-Semitism is particularly virulent. It's kind of what you would expect to an extent, because if you take any minority and you immerse them in a cauldron of hatred for 2,000 years, they begin to sometimes internalize that hatred and say, if the whole world hates me, maybe there's something wrong with me. And here is where the Jewish community has to learn from the African American community. When Black men and women were being shot by the police last summer, even amidst the pandemic, there were millions of people who marched throughout the world, and they didn't say, if African Americans or people of darker skin color, darker skin pigmentation are hated throughout the world and throughout history, there must be something wrong with them. No, they said there's something wrong with the people who are doing the hatred. They're racist, they're bigots, and they're expressing this terrible prejudice. We're going to march against it. Why doesn't the Jewish community do more of that? I sometimes think that we take Jewish self-introspection to an extreme. Of course, we should be introspective. Gosh, I hear Jews speaking all the time. Israel now is a very strong, dominant military power in the Middle East. It's a technological superpower. Now we have to contend with Jewish power. And true, we should always be moral. But sometimes we can take this introspection to such a degree that we begin to think that there's something wrong with us. We are not hated throughout history because we did anything wrong. We're not hated because Judaism is an offensive faith. We're not hated because our Jewish genetic genes are in any way defective or inferior. We're hated because the non-Jewish nations have had this disease called anti-Semitism. In the same way, they have a disease called racism. White people inexplicably hating people simply for the color of their skin. And now we call that out, the latter, unconditionally. Well, we have to learn to call out the former unconditionally as well. And let me just be clear. We have not done a sufficient job of examining this phenomenon of Jewish self-hatred, of a minority that experiences so much hatred for so long that they begin to believe there must be something wrong with them. Listen, even someone as notable as Henry Kissinger, and I was this past summer, I was rereading Walter Isaacson's masterful biography of Henry Kissinger, published about 2 decades ago. I read it when it first came out, but I reread it, and there's a famous quote from Henry Kissinger where he says, this is incredible. I mean, he might be one of the 10 most famous Jews of the 20th century, 5 most famous Jews. He actually said, there's a reason why the Jews are hated throughout, the centuries. It's an incredible quote that someone like him, because listen, during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Nixon was an anti-Semite. We know that from all of the secret recordings made in the White House. And yet Nixon moves to arm Israel during the 73 war, and he screams at Kissinger on the phone and says, why isn't this resupply of Israel going ahead? He was screaming at him, do it now. Kissinger was blocking it, hoping he could get a peace deal by Israel being bloodied. Bloodied meaning hundreds of soldiers dying. So you have a Jewish Secretary of State stopping an anti-Semitic American president from arming the only Jewish state. And Kissinger, of course, is a refugee from Hitler and the Nazis. None of this is believable, except in the context of how often this happens in our community. And I think we need to kind of unearth a lot of this and expose it as well, because you are still an anti-Semite if you hate the Jewish people, even if you yourself are Jewish, or if your criticism of Israel has crossed every line and is utterly irrational.
Yeah. Rabbi, the squad of Democrat politicians is bad enough without Bernie Sanders giving them extra support. How much influence do they have, and how do you read the current Biden administration with regards to Israel?
When I was the rabbi at Oxford, so Bernie Sanders' brother, Larry Sanders, was a regular at our Shabbat table, a very fine man. He would later run for Parliament, the Green Party. He lost to be Oxford's MP, but a very fine man. And, when Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2016, and the election was 2016, he started in 2015, right after the Gaza war. And if you remember, he accused Israel of killing 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Even Hamas's estimates, that was almost 5 times, even Hamas's estimates, a Jewish senator from Vermont engaging in a blood libel. What is a blood libel? It's where you falsely accuse the Jews of murder. And I remember I called up Larry, and I now live in the United States. I don't see him a lot, obviously, but he was very, he listened to me, and I said to him, this is really unacceptable. Bernie Sanders has been a terrible disappointment, because I have no issue with his politics. Like I said, I don't want to live in communist China with only one party. I don't want to live in Putin's Russia with only one party. I'm so happy that there's left and right. In fact, there's a famous Jewish Kabbalistic metaphor that says that, a bird flies specifically because of antithetical propulsion from the left and the right, 2 wings pushing against one another. If it had 2 wings on both sides, 2 right wings, 2 left wings, it would just flop around on its belly. So I like the antithetical propulsion of a conservative party, of a liberal party, but nothing to do with Bernie Sanders' politics. His I don't know if the word detestation of Israel or his prejudice against Israel, it violates every value that he himself says that he wants to always articulate, standing up for the downtrodden, etc. You got one democracy in the Middle East, only one country where women's rights are respected, LGBTQ rights. The only place in the Middle East where Arabs vote, the only place where where Arab citizens can speak out openly against the government and say they hate Naftali Bennett, they hate Netanyahu, and nothing will happen to them. I mean, try doing that even in Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority. And here you have Bernie Sanders not comprehending, how he's trampling on all his own ideals of democracy. So I want to separate for a moment. I think it's unfair to bundle Biden together with Rashida Tlaib or Bernie Sanders or Ilhan Omar or even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or any of the squad. While it's absolutely true that Biden is coming under tremendous pressure from those actors in the Democratic Party and the left-wing fringe of the party, which is no longer, unfortunately, just a fringe, it's also true that he has not yet succumbed to that pressure. He stood mightily with Israel during the war, the recent war. He has stood with Israel since. I'm actually very pleased with what he's doing. Listen, when it comes to Israel policy, he's not Donald Trump. Donald Trump was off the scales supporter of Israel in a way that was utterly unexpected. And I'm not saying this as a Republican or a Democrat. I'm saying this just based on the facts. I'm not going to go through the whole list of what Trump did for Israel, because the list is just so long. Not that other presidents didn't do wonderful things as well. Listen, Obama increased aid to Israel significantly just before he left office, even though Obama also, passed the Iran nuclear agreement, which was an American abomination. Funding, giving $50 billion, even the funding he gives to Israel, 3.8 billion a year. Iran got 50 billion in unfrozen assets. And for those who say, well, it was Iran's money, it wasn't. It's the Iranian people's money. It's not the government's money. It's a kleptocracy. They just steal the money and they give it to the mullahs. But be that as it may, Biden has so far not capitulated or surrendered to the pressure from the left wing of the party. So I wouldn't bundle him together with it's really going to come down to this. What will Biden do about resurrecting Obama's nuclear agreement? And the news this week in the United States is that the Biden people are beginning to think that there's no resurrection of the deal now that such a hardliner was elected as Iran's president. And I got to tell you, the Iran nuclear agreement, that is going to be the deciding factor for Biden's legacy vis-a-vis Israel, because all Israelis believe that the greatest threat to their existence and to their very continuity is not Hamas, although they're genocidal, and it's not Hezbollah, although they're genocidal. It's really Iran. And of course, Hezbollah is nothing but an Iranian proxy army. And so far, we haven't seen Biden's administration resurrecting the Iran nuclear agreement.
Okay, Michael, you ask your question, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah. Finally, for me, Rabbi, look, most American Jewish organizations have now become, in our view, very woke and shifted to the left. In particular, the Anti-Defamation League, which is run by a former Obama staffer and is now almost like the Jewish branch of the Democrat Party, the American Jewish Committee, and perhaps even AIPAC, with the only true Zionist organization now in America, the ZOA. Are you concerned about Israel's future relationship with America in the years to come?
Well, look, I'm always concerned about Israel's relationship with the United States because of how vital it is to Israel's security. Israel doesn't have a lot of friends. We live in a world that's not very just and it's not very moral. But the United States is just and moral, and it is mighty, thank God. And it is Israel's great friend, and it's been Israel's very reliable friend. Really, I guess you can say probably since the Kennedy administration in the early 60s. John F. Kennedy was pro-Israel, not as pro-Israel as his brother, who was actually murdered by a Palestinian, Sirhan, because of how pro-Israel Robert Kennedy was. But sadly, he was, of course, tragically assassinated and never elected to office. But Eisenhower was probably anti-Israel, which is really strange when you think that he's the one that ordered that they film the American liberation of the Nazi death camps. He knows what the Jews went through, but Eisenhower had very little sympathy for Israel. But since the Kennedy administration, and especially beginning, as I said before, ironically enough, with the Nixon administration and coming all the way through, George W. Bush, great friends of Israel, and culminating with Trump, who was far and away Israel's absolutely most reliable friend in the Oval Office. The United States has been Israel's great ally. So I'm always concerned about that relationship because it's so key. It's so vital. Do I think it's going to get worse under Biden? I actually don't. Biden is not going to be Donald Trump when it comes to pro-Israel policies. But then again, even George W. Bush wasn't. Ronald Reagan wasn't. You take some of Israel's great friends and Trump just outdid them all. You could argue about anything else Trump did, and I'm absolutely aware of his extremely controversial legacy, but not when it comes to Israel and not when it comes to the Middle East. Trump was the only one to bring about a peace deal since Jimmy Carter. And let's remember that Jimmy Carter actually calls Israel an apartheid state, which is kind of shocking. Well, maybe it isn't so shocking, unfortunately, but I don't believe, so Biden has been a lifelong friend of the Jewish state. The reason why Biden came into question was really because of how passionately he sold the Iran nuclear agreement in 2015. He was one of President Obama's most important surrogates. It was really, Kerry was the most pro the deal, then Obama, and then Biden. Biden was like number 3. But now I look back and I say to myself, maybe it was because Biden just felt that, look, this isn't my administration, it's Obama's administration. I'm his vice president. I have to be loyal to the president. And so he pushed it very hard, because right now we see Biden as president and he has not pushed the Iran nuclear agreement very hard. Listen, they are negotiating in Vienna. Those negotiations have been going on for months. But when's the last time you saw Biden really talk about the Iran nuclear agreement? Barely. He certainly hasn't made it a centerpiece of his foreign policy. He has made support for Israel a centerpiece. He has not engaged in any pro-BDS actions or statements. And as I said, in the recent war, he was absolutely reliable. I think and as far as all the Jewish organizations, AIPAC or, Jonathan Greenblatt, who you mentioned, head of ADL, he's a friend of mine. Yeah, it could well be that ADL is tilting left and more in line with the Democratic Party. And it could be that AIPAC would like to always state that they're centrist, but, that could be as well. That's okay, as far as I'm concerned, so long as there's other pro-Israel organizations that cater more to the right. I want to see like the spectrum across the community. The problem is that Israel dare not become a partisan issue. I am absolutely committed to that. I don't want to see the Corbynization of Israel in American politics. That happened in the UK. Remember, I spent 11 years in the UK. 6 of my 9 children were born in the UK, thank God. I remember the beginning of anti-Israel policy. So now you have Boris Johnson, very pro-Israel. But you have the Labour Party, they're lost to Israel. Is that a positive development? I don't think so. And I don't want that to happen here in the United States either. I don't want to see the Republicans today are much more pro-Israel. There's no question about that when it comes to policy. But I wish that weren't the case. I wish the Democrats and Republicans were equally pro-Israel. Let me finally say, you sometimes find in the Democratic Party some of the most stellar supporters of Israel, like Senator Robert Menendez of my own state of New Jersey, who was one of the most vocal critics during the Obama administration against the Iran deal. And he's a Democrat. So you find a lot of friends in both parties.
Okay, thanks. Right, we'll go to questions now. I'll be starting with Jeff, Terry and David. Please keep the questions short and please don't make speeches. Jeff, you're first, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Shalom, Rabbi. You mentioned very early on that the shock with respect to self-hating Jews hating Israel has to stop. And indeed, one has to contemplate that the New York Times has been for 80 years practicing this ignoble art of Jew hatred in the process of supporting initially Stalin, then having failed to report on the Holocaust, and now they merely hate Israel. So it is not at all surprising that the New York Jews, as well as elsewhere, are actually antagonists to Israel for the simple reason these people should be legally destroyed in the courts. But of course, we have not much hope of that. In the
question, Jeff, please.
The question is, why can't we do something about it? About the pathetic reporting and sue the so-called the bees, as I might put them.
Well, I believe that the truth can win and will win arguments in the marketplace of ideas. I believe that if you have a robust Jewish communication apparatus, which we've never developed, then that's the best way to respond. I believe if we can cultivate a generation of eloquent and articulate young men and women who write op-eds, who master social media, who master video output, who do Zoom sessions like these and make the case, I think that we will win the argument in the marketplace of ideas, and that's the best way to respond. Why have we failed so much? Because let's admit it, Jews suck at 2 things. They're great at education, thank God, philanthropy, religion, community, family, I could go on. We suck at sports and we suck at public relations. Now, at sports, we're getting better. Israel won a gold medal in Tokyo, but at PR, we still suck. We've sucked for 2,000 years. So why are Jews who are so people of the book, people of the word, we master so many, Jewish writers have been Nobel Prize winners, novelists. Why are we so bad at PR? I'll tell you why. Because we believe that it's actually a very shallow pursuit. We don't believe in it. And I know this more than most because I spent my entire, well, as a rabbi, I hate using the word career. I prefer the word calling. So I spent my entire calling over 3 decades. I've been in public life for 33 years. I've spent it very attuned to media, newspapers, television. When the internet started, I remember when it all began. Gosh, I sound like a real dinosaur. I guess I am. And I have been pilloried in the Jewish community for focusing on public relations. Oh my God, Rabbi Boteach, you are so shallow because you go on TV, or you're so shallow because you host TV. You're so shallow because you do Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Or I've been shocked at how much attacks I've taken. Just you're an attention seeker. You're a publicity seeker. Imagine that. If a community believes that trying to master some of the modern forms of communication is nothing but publicity seeking, then you can imagine if we see it as something so shallow, then any Israeli politician that tries to do it like Netanyahu, we're going to say, oh, he's just a shallow attention seeker. Anyone who writes op-eds for Israel, oh, they're very good on Israel, but what an attention seeker. By having that stupid philosophy, you're going to have very articulate Jewish men and women withdraw and say, chemistry and physics, biology. Now that's a very meaningful pursuit. Education, being a professor at university, that's a meaningful pursuit. But mastering media, no, that's very shallow. And we've thought this way for generations. Go all the way back for a moment. The greatest missed opportunity in the history of the world goes back 2,000 years when you think about it. You have a man named St. Paul, and this is a totally different discussion, but I'll only spend 30 seconds on it. You have a man St. Paul. We don't know a lot about him. The New Testament says that he was a student of Gamaliel. He was Jewish. We're not sure. He probably couldn't even speak and read Hebrew. But he looks at Judaism and he says, you know what? This is an incredible collection of ideas. But the Jews never get their message out. I bet if I start writing these epistles, if I change some of the things, he didn't call it Christianity, but if I change some of the practices and I take the ideas and I write these letters, these epistles to the Romans and the Galatians, then it's going to be huge. And he kind of brings this message of Judaism light, i.e. Christianity, to the whole world. And Christianity ends up becoming the most successful idea in the history of the world. And I, as a rabbi, I look at this and I say to myself, why didn't the Jews try to communicate a message of universal values to the entire world? I don't mean to convert the world to Judaism. We're not a proselytizing faith. But we do believe in converting the world to Jewish ideas, if not to Jewish practices. The Ten Commandments, monotheism, the Sabbath, right? We never did it because we never believed in getting a message out, and we still don't believe it. So the answer is not to file suit or anything like that. The answer is to master media and master the art of communication. And I have to tell you that for a people who are commanded by God in the Bible to be or goyim nisaticha, a light unto the nations, that is a PR calling, right? Get your light out, get your message out, communicate a positive message to humanity. And God Almighty, in the time of this coronavirus pandemic, when people are so forlorn and so broken and they're isolated, and you have even the greatest gymnasts of all time, like Simone Biles, speaking about mental health at the Olympics, and this feeling of brokenness, and a Jewish message about God, positivity, the Sabbath, community, family, God's law is so critical, and we're just failing at communicating that message.
Good point. Terry, please unmute yourself.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Good morning, Rabbi. Sorry to get you up so early. We're seeing at the moment a significant uptick in the level of anti-Semitism worldwide. And as you say, the fig leaf for this is anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is more often than not anti-Semitism. And you quite rightly pointed out that a lot of the criticism of Israel really is why Israel, as opposed to all these other dreadful countries. But in that question is part of the answer, is it not? That the things that Israel is usually accused of, whether it being an apartheid state or genocide or whatever, they're all totally, completely and utterly untrue. And that message never gets across.
We need a question, Terry.
Yes, I'm coming to that. What can we do to get across the message that the things Israel is serially accused of are just simply untrue?
Well, the answer is we have to be extremely careful as we master the art of communication, not to be put in the defendant's chair where we're only responding and saying, well, that's not true and that's not true. You remember I think it was Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Johnson, LBJ, who told his communications person, oh, attack my opponent and say he did this. He said, it's not true. He said, let him deny it. Then the story becomes he denied it. We Jews, Israel is not an apartheid state. We're here to say that we're not a Nazi regime. We're here to say that we don't engage in genocide. Well, what do you think the story is going to be? Jews deny, Israel denies that it's an apartheid state. Why did we ever allow ourselves to be put in the defendant's chair at all? How did we? The answer, of course, is when your opponent sees the communications initiative and they project their message first, you're put on the defensive. We should take the initiative. We're the ones, about 20 years ago, a close friend of mine, who now runs a big Jewish newspaper called the Jewish Journal, David Suissa, he came to me like 20 years ago and he said, Shmuley, I really want to start this initiative called Free the 400 Million. I said, who are the 400 million? He said, they're the Arabs of the Middle East. Israel and the Jews should be at the forefront of demanding. He almost like prophesied the Arab Spring. He said, we should be at the forefront of demanding the Arabs should have rights, that they should have freedom of press, freedom to congregate, freedom to criticize their governments without fear. We didn't do that. In fact, even when the Arab Spring came, we were a bit reluctant because we're not sure what's going to happen if these Arab governments democratize. In Egypt, in the Gulf states, we're a little bit concerned because we see guys like Mohammed Morsi being elected from the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt. But the point is, if we don't communicate a message at first, if Israel and the Jewish community if we don't communicate a message of democracy, human rights, the infinite value of the human person, which is in Genesis chapter 1, the very beginning of our Torah, that everyone is God's children. Last week's Torah reading, Banim atem Lashem Elokeichem, you are children to the Lord your God. Whenever I debate Christian missionaries and they say Jesus was the Son of God, I said, of course he was. As am I, as are you. Every one of us, the Bible says it clearly, we're all the children of God. Well, children of God deserve rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights. When we don't articulate this and say this is what Israel stands for, now why doesn't Hamas practice any of this? Why doesn't Mahmoud Abbas, who's in the 17th year of his 4-year term, elected to 4? When we don't articulate this, we're put on the defensive. They come along and they say, we believe in human rights and Israel is an apartheid state. No, we're not an apartheid state. Whenever you're on the defensive, you're losing. And ask anyone who's ever ran for office. If you're on the defensive, you're losing. So this is not about responding to the lies said about Israel, although that's also important, but that's of secondary importance. What's of primary importance is for us to say, what do we represent? What does the Jewish community represent? If you were to do, and I've done this when I was at Oxford, if you take some of your non-Jewish friends and you say, let's play a little game. I say boy, he'll say girl, day, night. When you bring up the word Jew or Jewish community, often you hear the word money. It's quite shocking. Not from anti-Semites, not from people who hate Jews, God forbid. They just think that Jews are brilliant businessmen. They think it's a compliment. Jews are great at making money. That may be true. I hope it's true. Nothing wrong with that. Resources are critical to charity and feeding the hungry and taking care of our families and paying day school tuition, of course. But is that the main thing that we want to be known for? Isn't the main thing we want to be known for is the God's light to the nations, the light of human rights, the light of human dignity, the light of human freedom? That's what we're supposed to be known for. And I don't know how we came to be known for money. I don't get it. And it's not easy. Like I said, it's so easy for us to just say anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. Yeah, of course there's anti-Semitism. I spend so much of my life fighting it. I wish I didn't have to, but I don't want to only blame blame our opponents. I also want to take a look in the mirror. We're speaking to a Jewish audience mostly here. And it's too convenient to simply say, the world hates us. They'll never accept our messages. They're never going to like us. No. That's too convenient. We have the responsibility of a communicative community is to communicate their values, and we are not sufficiently communicating our values. When I published Kosher Sex when I was the rabbi at Oxford, there was like a storm in the Jewish community. The non-Jewish world loved it, thank God. It became an international bestseller. The Jewish community attacked it. What are rabbis doing writing about sex? I mean, seriously? You're wondering why the Jewish community is trying to save marriages and bring down the divorce rate? You're wondering why a child of divorce like me, who was like a yo-yo between parents as you kind of become through no fault of your parents when marriages dissolve, you're wondering why someone like that would want to try to rescue marriages and share the from the well springs of Jewish wisdom with the rest of the world, I just don't get it. I really feel at times that we allow our community to be defined entirely by anti-Semitism. What does the Jewish community stand for? We stand for fighting our enemies. We stand for fighting our opponents. Well, let me tell you something. We saw how that ends. Look at the Trump administration. You know, to say that Donald Trump was just a terrible president of people who hate his guts, you know, okay, if I'm speaking to a Republican audience, they think he's a phenomenal president. Speaking to the Democratic audience, they think he was, you know, Satan or worse. It's amazing what people will say. But what certainly happened with the Trump administration is after a while, the administration became only about fighting back against its critics, fighting back against its enemies. The truth is the Trump administration had a lot of incredible accomplishments, like the Abraham Accords or incredible support for Israel, let alone trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, trade agreements with China. I could go on. But what is remembered is constant fighting against their enemies. Now, you could say it's not the administration's fault. They were assailed, attacked constantly. I'm not even talking about January 6th, which was a terrible American abomination. That was a disgrace, of course. But when you only respond to your critics and you don't begin to articulate what you're about, that's all people remember, is that you fought and fought and fought and fought. And then people get tired and weary and they say, I can't take this anymore. And so I want our community to communicate its values and not always be on the defense.
Good point. David Schulberg, you're next. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Rabbi, my question is the 25% of American Jews that think Israel is an apartheid state, 22% that think Israel is practicing genocide against the Palestinians. Is this indicative of the serious demise of the American Jewish community?
Very good question. Let me throw you a curveball and say that I'm not as concerned about that recent study as I am about what its origin is, what its cause is. That 25%, they don't know a thing about the Middle East. I bet you they can't find Israel on a map. They certainly can't find Lebanon or Jordan. They can't find it on a map. For the most part, they're utterly ignorant of Middle Eastern history, Middle Eastern politics, global geopolitics. They just see what they read in the newspapers, and they see Israel with Apache helicopter gunships and F-18 fighter planes or F-16 fighter planes or whatever we're up to right now, thank God, F-22s. And they see the Palestinians throwing rocks, and they say, oh, David and Goliath, and now David is the Palestinians, and the Jews are Goliath, and then you get 25%, oh, Israel's at fault. We call that underdogma, right? Where you just immediately choose the underdog. You're ignorant of the entire situation. You just assume that the weaker party is the just and righteous party. By the way, I always say to people, one of the great movies that I ever saw was the movie Downfall, about the last days of Adolf Hitler in his bunker. And if you see that movie, which is very historical, the underdog are the Nazis, of course. In the last 6 months of the war, not the last year, all of Germany was the underdog. They were being bombed day and night. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. So are you going to say, therefore, because the Allies had overwhelming air superiority and being crushed from the east by Stalin's Red Army and from the west through D-Day and Normandy, are you going to say that Germany was therefore the just party because they were the It's stupid. What I'm more concerned about is what these statistics say. I'm sorry, what the origin is. The origin, of course, is assimilation. If you did that same poll among Orthodox Jews or traditional Jews or Jews who send their kids to Jewish day schools or Jews who've gone on birthright, which is an amazing phenomenon. By the way, let me say that today, August 4th, is the 88th birthday of Sheldon Adelson, the greatest Jewish American philanthropist, who I was very close to. And he would have been 88 today, and he was the biggest funder of Birthright, and he deserves a mention because he's one of the great figures of modern Jewish history. And he died in January, and I miss him very much. But if you ask the same question among Jews who are not assimilated, or at least who identify, they're not going to say that, because even though they may not know as much about the history, even as much as the other group, the fact is that they identify, so they care about Israel. So assimilation is a big problem. And an assimilated community is not going to support Israel. Look at the fact that about 90% of Olim today, 90% of people making Aliyah are Orthodox. So we can no longer separate between Jewish observance and support for Israel. By and large, we're beginning to see the two converge, that the more traditional you are in your Jewishness, Jewish practice, Jewish identity, the more you're going to support Israel because it's the Jewish state. And the less you care about your Jewishness, the less you're going to care about their being a Jewish state, which allows me to conclude this question by simply saying, you know what, I believe, you know, when I was a young American Jew being raised in Chabad, a lot of people said that there was, you know, there was kind of a conflict between the vision of Theodor Herzl, let's all move to Israel, and of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. No, let's send out emissaries to the rest of the world and tell people they don't have to move to Israel because we'll build them mikvahs and Jewish day schools, Jewish camps, etc. Now you see how those two visions converge. Israel is dependent on a thriving diaspora, and a thriving diaspora has to have a homeland in Israel. The Rebbe's vision and Herzl's vision are uniquely symbiotic, and we're seeing that the more that we have Jews who do go to shul, who put their kids in a Jewish school, who visit Israel, the more they will support Israel. And they're not part of that 25%. Even if they don't know the history as much, they care because they're Jewish.
Miriam, I've got you next in line, so please unmute yourself. And look, there are some people still lined up. I suspect we won't get to you, so I apologize for that. But Miriam, please ask your question. Miriam's iPhone 8.
Not unmuting.
No, not unmuting.
Successfully, so we might need to get someone else.
All right, let's, okay, then after Miriam was David's iPhone. So David, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi. Look, my question concerns our investments that we're making in order to negate anti-Semitism. You will be aware, I don't know whether you're aware, in Australia, there's recently been an enormous amount of money being invested, and with government support to build Jewish museums and Holocaust museums, and there's an education program to get teachers to go and to bring that back to schools, non-Jewish teachers, etc., to hopefully deliver pro-Semitism. Yet we all know, statistically, there's a rise in anti-Semitism. Inverse to that investment. What is your view about that, and what other measures do you think are appropriate to deliver the pro-Semitic agenda rather than the rise in anti-Semitism that we're currently experiencing?
Yeah, so, you know, when I was at Oxford, there was actually a scholar then, I don't know if he's still alive, I hope he is, but there was a Jewish scholar who was very controversial because he basically said that he doesn't want to ever study about anti-Semitism. He doesn't want to talk about it because he said it's not a Jewish subject. He said the fact that the non-Jewish nations have this problem, this disease called anti-Semitism, it's their problem. Why are we spending all our time hearing how much they hate our guts? Why are we teaching our kids all this? And while I don't agree with him because we have to fight back against anti-Semitism, and to say that would take it to an extreme and say the Holocaust is not a Jewish subject, it's a German subject, which is ridiculous. In fact, one of the last trips I did before international trips before COVID was going to Auschwitz for the 75th anniversary of its liberation on January 27th, 2020. I was at Auschwitz. It was a great honor. I just published a book called Holocaust Holiday. I hope you'll all buy it. Holocaust Holiday, which tells the story of how often I took my kids to the Nazi German concentration camps and the pain of taking our kids there, and the kids being very upset at times that we would have, you know, summer holidays, as it were, at Buchenwald, Majdanek, Birkenau. So I say this because when you ask about funding for programs that are designed to, I don't know, instill a Jewish identity or fight anti-Semitism, let's just remember, and I'm trying to be consistent tonight your time, this morning my time, I'm trying to be consistent. I don't want Jewish identity coming down to fighting anti-Semitism. I don't want Jews to only be on the defensive. I don't want young Jews hearing that all that it's ever done is that we're hated. That's why I said I use Chabad as an example of a positive educational program of camps, of summer camps. Right now, it's summer in the United States, Jewish day schools, educational programs. Of course, when I was at Kaufman Synagogue, I was brought to do some of those programs. So I would like to see sufficient investment to push back against anti-Semitism and programs that are designed to do that. And listen, my organization, if any of you want to have a good cause to support, we do a lot of that, and it's critical, the World Values Network. But I always tell people, I say the World Values Network is about three things. We fight anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias, and that's what we're kind of famous for, thank God, these giant ads that we do, and it's a specialty for us, and I'd like to believe that we're good at it, and we've really pushed back against Israel's enemies in the world's leading publications, and done so successfully, thank God. But I always say to people, that's not enough. We're the Jewish Values Network, the World Values Network. We promote global values. We promote strong family, whether it's Jewish values as it pertains to child rearing, human sexuality, marriage, human dignity, pushing back against things like depression and anxiety and all these things that are kind of permeating the Western world. And I'd like to see our community really taking the lead, because young Jews are only going to identify with their traditions and their culture, and in my opinion, and their religion, if they feel it has some kind of global import. They want to know that they're part of a community of communities, that they're part of a community of nations. And the idea of Jewish isolation, it doesn't work anymore. We have to learn how to be Jewish amidst living among all other nations. And that means contributing to all the nations and not seeing the non-Jewish world as assaulting us. I don't want to see a fortress Israel. I don't want to see another Masada, God forbid. I don't want that. I want us feeling confident. And it's very hard. Don't get me wrong. Right now, it's very hard. You wear a yarmulke in the street, you wear a beard, you wear a Magen David, and you could be attacked. I never believed that we would see Jews attacked in Times Square and the streets of Los Angeles and Toronto. I lived in Oxford. I knew it happened in London, in Paris, in Belgium, Berlin. My wife and I were in Paris like 2 years ago. We were at the Orsay Museum, most famous museum of modern art in the world. And the woman is selling my wife a ticket, and she says, "Why don't you put away your Magen David?" And she said, "I'm not an anti-Semite. I don't want you to get attacked." And I'm thinking, she's going to get attacked in the Orsay Museum? I mean, are you kidding me? Now that's happening in Times Square. I'd be even more shocked that it's happening in Times Square. So I'm not denying how serious the outbreak of violence against Jewry and anti-Semitism is. It's incredibly serious. It's shocking. We have to push back against it, but we cannot be defined by it. Because I'm telling you, if we define ourselves by that, well, all the people who I'm looking at in the gallery here on Zoom will want to join in that battle, because you guys are committed Jews and you care about the community and you care about the state of Israel, and you're fighters. Young Jews are going to look at this saying, "Oh my God, I went to campus. I want to be part of this society and that society. And now you're pulling me to like fight for Israel, and that should be my whole identity, and just go to Hillel and just go Chabad, and I won't have any other identity." It's not going to work. That's why when I ran the L'chaim Society at Oxford, I had 5,000 non-Jewish members. I was trying to teach our Jewish students how to be Jewish among their non-Jewish friends, and to assert and affirm a proud and positive Jewish identity. And that's something that we're failing at. So Fortress Israel does not work. It'll lead to rampant assimilation. And that's why we have to wear yarmulkes in the street. No matter how much we're being attacked now, don't take them off. I went on the attack against, I can't remember his name, Biden's Jewish advisor during the campaign. If you remember, this put out a tweet like 3 or 4 months ago. He put out a tweet that said, "Painful as it is for me to say this, this is the Jewish advisor to the president of the United States, the most powerful man on earth." He said, "Painful as it is for me to say it, if you're not safe, take off your yarmulke, hide your Magen Davids." Could you imagine an American advisor to the president of the United States was saying that, Jewish advisor? Instead of saying, "Mr. President, stop the anti-Semitism, make it safe for Jews," what was he next going to do? Tell the African-American community they should do something about their skin color, God forbid? No, you tell America to stop being racist. You tell people to stop hating people for the color of their skin, and to stop American prejudice, and to recognize some of the abominations of American history, like slavery or Jim Crow, segregation, etc. You push back against hatred. You don't tell people to hide their yarmulkes. What the heck is wrong with that guy? And it's amazing, only when it comes to being Jewish do people say such stupid things, such offensive drivel. So, and we have to call it out as offensive drivel. We as Jews are no better than any other minority, and we are no worse. We are chosen by God to spread the message of human dignity to all nations, preaching the gospel of human equality to all nations, that God invites them and wants them and respects them. That's what we're chosen for. What an incredible mission. We're not better than anyone. We're not worse than anyone. Well, let's start emphasizing a little bit of the not worse than anyone as well.
Yeah, very well said. Now, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We're approaching time, so apologies to those who didn't get a question. I'm going to ask Robert Wheel to thank Rabbi Shmuley. Just before we do, you mentioned your new book. I was going to mention it. Just tell people where they can buy it. And the other website I think that you have is World Values Network. So perhaps just a word about that too.
Well, firstly, anyone that wants to follow what I'm doing. Oh, I see you guys put Holocaust Holiday. Yeah, so I just published Holocaust Holiday a month ago. I'm so proud of it. It's not only a history of the Holocaust, but it's also a history of our families visiting the Holocaust sites and how painful it is to take children to these places, and whether or not it's even a good idea. When the Washington Post published a 3,000-word kind of excerpt about the book that I took my kids on a Holocaust holiday, so many people pushed back and said, what kind of horrible father are you? You can't take your children to a genocide site. My daughter Chetziva, who's the youngest of 9 children, thank God, her birthday is the day before the 4th of July, 3rd of July. And I say in the book, she turns to her parents, my Australian wife, Debbie, who grew up in Dover Heights in Sydney. And she turns to me and she says, Tati, please don't make me spend my birthday in Auschwitz, because we were supposed to be in Auschwitz on July the 4th. Instead, so we took her to, I heeded her request. We took her to the Lodz ghetto. One of the, it was painful. Now, why did I take them there? Because never again has to mean never again. That means, unfortunately, kind of exposure. It's part of the tragedy of our history. But like I said, we can't only be tragic. So, but the book just came out. I'd love for you guys to order it. Anyone that wants to follow me and stay in touch, please follow me on Instagram at Rabbi Shmuley. Facebook, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, Twitter, at Rabbi Shmuley. I write for the Jerusalem Post every single week. This week, I wrote about Simone Biles and why there's a global pandemic of anxiety. It's not only born of COVID-19, but COVID-19 has, of course, exacerbated it. By the way, let me also just finally say, I said before that there is a price to be paid if we want to be Fortress Israel and just become an insular community that sees the whole world as hating us. And by the way, you see it, if I may, get a little bit controversial for a moment. You see it with how Australia has responded to the pandemic, because Australia was first the most successful country in the world dealing with the pandemic. It decided, look, we're an island nation. We are a fortress. We can cut off from the rest of the world in a way that no one else can. No one gets in, no one gets out, and there's no COVID. And it worked. You guys were unmasked like a year ago when we were being brutalized. But now, a year later, people are kind of looking at that strategy and saying, maybe, maybe not. There wasn't, the vaccines weren't sufficiently widespread. There's no herd immunity. I'm not here to choose whether that was right or wrong. I'm just showing you that the fortress mentality has a flip side always. It always has another side. Doesn't always work. Cutting yourself off from the world, as kind of the United States wanted to do after the First World War, and what they practiced until they were attacked by the Japanese on the 7th of December 1941 in the Second World War, doesn't work. So now the United States has chosen engagement. They're just trying to find the balance. Jewish community has to find the same thing. Let me finally just say, go to, if you want to look at our websites, shmuley.com and worldvalues.us, shmuley.com, worldvalues.us. Whoever would like to support our work, the ads that we do cost huge fortunes of resources, but they're worth it. They are extremely effective. We fight very hard against Israel's enemies. We do it with clarity of purpose. We do it with phenomenal courage and conviction, thank God. And I think we're very effective. So go to worldvalues.us, and thank you very much. I love Australia. I miss all you guys. My wife wants to visit her parents so badly. I want to visit my in-laws. I want to visit all my dear friends like Robert Wheel and the Caulfield community and so many other people who even see it. We can't yet, but we pray for a time when this disgusting, vile virus will be pushed like, a wind from God will come and dispel it. And all of us will be able to meet up. We'll all be healthy and well and health and wellness and all that good stuff. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Robert. I'd like you to just say a brief thank you to Rabbi Shmuley, and then we'll do some housekeeping and we'll let the rabbi go.
Well, first of all, thank you to the AJA for putting on another wonderful event, and thank you for allowing Caulfield Shul to participate in it, which we really enjoyed. Thank you, Shmuley, for staying up all night.
You gave away my secret.
I shared an apartment with him in New Zealand a couple of years ago for a couple of nights.
We had a great time.
He was up all night typing columns for the Jerusalem Post and ads for the New York Times. And I remember even being interviewed by Tracy Grimshaw on a current affair at some ridiculous hour. Anyway, so thank you, Shmuley, for your friendship. Thank you for the wonderful presentation tonight. Love to all the family. We miss you and we hope we can be together in person again soon.
Thanks, Robert. Very well said. Now, we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to close off. Rabbi Shmuley, feel free to leave whenever you want to. Just before I hand over to David, a reminder that on Radio 3ZZZ, immediately following us, which is now, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is airing. So we encourage people to have a listen. David, I'll hand over to you for the final wrap-up.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Shmuley, for a very interesting discussion and very much on the wavelength of AJA and the way we treat Israel advocacy. So I'll just show people what's happening next week. We're moving from the US to Europe. We have the chair of the Jewish branch of the AfD party in Germany joining us to talk about Jewish life in Germany, in the EU, and of course, some of the problematic issues of the relationship between the EU and Israel. And finally, as we always do, if anyone here is not yet properly connected to AJA, firstly, go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, join the email list, and you'll get our information directly. Like and follow AJA's Facebook page. And finally, also on the website, if you're not yet a member and if you can make a contribution, please consider doing one or both of those things. Alan, just time to say
okay.
goodbye.
Thanks, David. Thanks to Michael for joining us again tonight in a Nothing Left reprise. We look forward to seeing you all again next week. So until then, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.